A big gaming story of 2018 is Fortnite, this genre of game where the winner is last shooter or last team standing. And that is Battle Royale.
Question: what would you call the genres for the following games? Clannad, Detroit Become Human, and Metroid Prime. If you said romance adventure, open scenario adventure, and first-person adventure, congratulations, you somehow came up with the exact terms that Japanese Wikipedia uses. If you're like me though, you probably said something along the lines of visual novel, interactive movie/adventure game, and first-person shooter/action adventure/Metroidvania. The point here isn't that Japanese somehow classifies all these as adventure games. In fact, for Metroid Prime, I'm pretty sure only Nintendo calls it that. Instead, these are pretty good examples to demonstrate that, in Japanese, game genres are treated a bit more like taglines. So you get unusual, non-standard genre descriptors like AI action, high-speed deductive action, and ruin exploration archaeology action. And yet, that does raise an interesting question. Why do I know that these genres don't sound natural in English? After all, English is no stranger to complex, non-standard genre descriptors, and to a non-native speaker, saying Overwatch is a team-based multiplayer first-person shooter could sound just as unnatural as the phrase Overwatch is a team-based competitive action shooting game does to English speakers. So why is that? Why does calling Super Mario Odyssey a 3D platformer feel more natural than calling it a 3D action game? Why does describing Acceleration of Suguri 2 as a competitive bullet hell fighting game sound totally acceptable, but calling La Mulana a ruin exploration archaeology action game sound absurd? What rules of English genre description am I subconsciously following that might not be the case in other languages? Or, to put it succinctly, in English, how are game genres named? Before we begin, we need to scope out what we mean by game genre. As a word, genre essentially means type, or class, or style. It comes from French, where it was borrowed into English twice, first as the word gender, and later on as the word genre. As a categorization system, genre is a way of organizing artistic works into groups of perceived similarity. It's commonly used in literature, music, film, and of course, games. And in practice, a genre is a loose collection of mental associations. People make different creative works, we notice patterns, conventions, and inbuilt assumptions amongst them, and so we come up with a shorthand to describe that similarity, that style. With game genres, it's common for these shorthand terms to describe a gameplay element, like fighting game. It's a game involving fighting. Other times, they name an aesthetic or thematic element, like horror game. You, experience the feeling of horror. And other times still, they point out aspects even more roundabout, like indie. This game is independently made, or of the style of independently made games. What's shared between all these different types of genres is that, while a name of a genre can describe almost any aspect, the named aspect is never the sole defining element of a genre. The term indie game, for instance, refers loosely to a game's production environment, but by extension, has connotations of things like smaller scope and more experimental game design. Even something straightforwardly descriptive like first-person shooter doesn't just mean a game where you shoot from first person. Embedded within that term are all kinds of unspoken assumptions, to where, if you asked for multiplayer FPS recommendations, you'd probably find Dead Space Extraction, a pretty misleading suggestion. In the language of cognitive linguistics and prototype theory, genres are fuzzy concepts with graded membership. That is, they don't have clear-cut you are or you aren't definitions. In the same way no specific amount of fame delineates whether an actor is or isn't a movie star, there's no specific amount of action which makes a game an action game. And just like how some birds are intuitively more bird-like than others, different examples of a genre can be more prototypical than others. Also, and this is often overlooked, since genres are man-made concepts, different languages and cultures can notice and name different patterns. It's why, say, the concept of a JRPG can be well accepted amongst English speakers, but be treated with some suspicion amongst Japanese game audiences. Or vice versa, how the Japanese concept of the shoujo game, a genre of game that features pretty 2D anime girls, doesn't really have a native English equivalent, where people would instead naturally call these kinds of games RPGs, or visual novels, or dating sims, or raising sims, or free-to-play mobile games, or basically any other genre description. What this all means is that when answering the question, how are game genres named, we're considering genre in a fairly broad sense. This includes genre terms frequently used in genre descriptors, and rare terms that are exclusive to specific subgenres, but excluding one-off modifiers like cute as heck. Now then, when it comes to answering how are game genres named, a good place to start is with syntax, or how are game genre names structured. While there are some single-word genre names like action or puzzle, which can stand on their own, most of the time people use a combination of terms to describe games. These range from simple two-word genre names to complex genre descriptors, but because language is not a fixed thing and genre is not a closed class, new genre terms are created all the time. It's how you get new specialized constructions like endless runner or modern military first-person shooter. However, and also importantly, these word constructions aren't random or unrestricted. You can say action-adventure, for instance, but generally not adventure-action. And you can call something an indie horror game easily enough, but not really an indie fantasy game. It just sounds off if you don't add in something like RPG. The first general reason why this is simply because certain genres are collocations, or set combinations of words that are commonly used together more often than by chance. Think things like make a mistake or broken bone. There's nothing wrong grammatically with saying damaged bone. People just don't usually say that. In that regard, third-person shooter is so frequently used it's basically a specialized term. Third-person action-adventure is a combination that is less common but recognizable, and third-person puzzle game, while grammatical, is basically never used. This is also why a Japanese genre term like crime action sounds funny or wrong to an English speaker. It's simply not a recognizable collocation the way GTA clone is. However, precedence isn't the only reason why certain combinations of genre terms sound natural. In truth, there are also subconscious syntactic patterns at play. Grammatically, genre names are noun phrases, composed of a base noun, the head, potential noun or adjective modifiers preceding it, and sometimes prepositional phrases following it. Genre names generally use game for their base noun, but in everyday contexts, it's common to omit it. Example, I love horror games versus I love roguelikes. Additional common genre formation patterns include the informal suffix acting as a productive replacement for the verbing game structure, shooting game, shooter, platforming game, platformer, city building game, city building. The informal like suffix for informal comparisons, roguelike, souls-like, Zack-like. The stigmatized clone suffix for derivative comparisons, GTA clone, Doom clone, Breakout clone. The rare verb 'em up construction coined by 80s UK gaming magazines, shoot 'em up, beat 'em up. Outside of those two specialized terms, this construction is fairly non-standard, so it can be used to describe a game style in a light-hearted or playful way. Cute 'em up, collect 'em up, or booze 'em up. And the catch-all sim/simulation/simulator ending for games that emulate, usually real life, subjects. Dating sim, farm life sim, flight simulator, fall management simulator. These base nouns are in turn modified by modifiers. Sometimes these are adjectives, example, immersive sim, but more often not, they are attributive nouns, example, fantasy RPG. Importantly, these modifiers tend to be arranged in a certain order. If you learned English as a second language, at some point you might have had to learn something like opinion, size, shape, age, color, origin, material, qualifier. For those unaware, this is the general pattern for how English speakers stack multiple adjectives. It's a description of how English speakers find it more natural to say amazing red coat instead of red amazing coat, or big brown cat instead of brown big cat. In a similar vein, when multiple genre terms are combined together to form a complex genre descriptor like 2D open-world beat-em-up, the terms generally have a natural-sounding order. It's not that open-world 2D beat-em-up is ungrammatical, it just sounds worse and feels less natural to English speakers. With that in mind, if I had to describe the order, I'd probably suggest something like this, which, for the sake of sanity, I generalize down to production element, player orientation, subject matter, game element. Or, as a rule of thumb, least notable to most defining. Alright, now that we've covered syntax, let's look at the terms. Because, as it turns out, there's a lot of recurring linguistic patterns in what English tends to name in genre descriptors. For the sake of organization, I've split these into 5 supercategories: production elements, player orientation, style of fiction, premise, and non-indicative. With production elements, these are things like monetization model, target audience, synonyms for old, production environment, geographic origin, purpose of work, hardware, and visual presentation. They cover the elements of a game's production or the game's existence as a product. While these terms don't explicitly name-drop design aspects, they often implicitly include them, along with connotations of things like aesthetics or difficulty. Player orientation terms cover things like group dynamic, camera framing, spatial navigation, and pacing. These terms describe things surrounding the in-game activity, not what the player does in the game, but how the player navigates it, in spatial, temporal, or relational terms. A party game, for instance, is a group dynamic term that uniquely specifies the expected social context for when you play this style of game. Style of fiction terms are common for games which lean heavily on being works of fiction. They borrow language from literary or cinematic genres, and as such tend to name either the setting or the type of story. Of these kinds of terms, horror is by far the most common, to where it's seen as a primary game genre. Premise terms are probably the most common way genres are named. Mostly they specify a game's subject matter, either the gameplay verb you do in the game, or the gameplay noun that you engage with. However, there are also terms that note the game's format. That is, where VR and mobile are hardware terms that describe how you play the game through a VR headset or a mobile phone. Board game and minigame collection describe how the game is structured around a game board or a compilation of various smaller games. Finally, there's non-indicative, my catch-all category for terms that are unclear or misleading. They can be non-indicative for many reasons, including being non-indicatively broad, abbreviations, named after influential works, joke names, and foreign language borrowings, mostly Japanese. Here, special mention has to go to the term blobber, an old-fashioned Western RPG genre term that is non-indicative in ways wholly unique to itself. So, how are game genres named? Well, the answer is, it varies. After all, genres, before they're categories on a store page, are words. They're the organic naming conventions that arise out of the communication needs of fans and marketers. Needs like saying, does anyone remember playing Flash dress-up games? Or, Pyre is a party-based RPG. In the process, these genre constructions follow language patterns that are intuitive to native speakers, but are practically invisible otherwise. It's why you won't find party-based in any dictionary. The only times when these patterns really become visible is when they're broken, generally because of different cultural conventions around genre names, or when the concept is simply not a recognizable convention in another culture. And that's what a lot of people miss about the logic of game genres. They're language, not formal scientific taxonomy. They can use metaphors or plain descriptions. They can refer to concepts near uselessly broad or hyper-specific. And sometimes, they're both. Thus, RPG doesn't literally mean a game where you play a role, and JRPG doesn't just mean an RPG from Japan. And, arguably, why Sim is more of a linguistic construction pattern like blank-like, than a genre with dozens of bizarrely different subgenres. Or, in other words, genres are cultural conventions, and cultural conventions can be anything.